In the summer of 1882, Frank Hamilton Cushing wrote down a strange piece of information that he could not easily classify. He was sitting at Zuni Pueblo, speaking with a rain priest who was describing old turquoise mines southwest of the settlement. But the story wasn't really about turquoise. According to the account Cushing recorded, something had been deliberately left inside chambers beneath the mines. These were not simply abandoned tunnels. They were described as enclosed spaces, rooms that had been intentionally sealed. And one detail made the story even more difficult to explain. Another Zuni elder claimed the chambers had been closed from the inside. More than a century later, the lower workings connected with this story remain inaccessible, and one archaeologist's records from the exact period when he entered those lower passages are missing. The mystery begins with the mines themselves. The Cerrillos Hills lie roughly 25 miles southwest of present-day Santa Fe, New Mexico. Spanish records from the early 1600s referred to the district as Las Minas de Chalchihuitl, the mines of green stone. But the history of extraction there reaches much further back. Zuni and other Pueblo peoples had been obtaining turquoise from these hills long before Spanish arrival. Archaeological material found in the upper accessible workings during examinations in the early 20th century included obsidian tools, whose source was located more than 100 miles away. That suggests that people were traveling considerable distances to obtain and work materials associated with the mines. And turquoise from the Cerrillos district didn't remain local. It has been recovered at major archaeological sites including Chaco Canyon, Mesa Verde, and locations in what is now Mexico. For generations, these hills were therefore connected to a much wider network of trade. But the most interesting evidence wasn't necessarily what the miners took out of the hills. It was what may have been left behind. The deepest portions of the principal shaft have never been reached by any documented excavation. And 3 researchers working independently during the 19th century described unusual marks on the walls of the lower workings. According to their observations, those marks did not correspond to any catalog tool type known from the surrounding region or neighboring areas. One of those researchers was Frank Hamilton Cushing. But he wasn't the first. In 1846, William Hemsley Emery traveled through the Cerrillos Hills as a United States Army topographical engineer. He was part of Stephen Cunney's Army of the West during the survey of territory recently acquired by the United States. Emery approached the mines as a surveyor, not as someone searching for a mystery. His official notes described the major openings and recorded the scale of the workings. What caught his attention was their size. He considered the amount of extraction to be far greater than what documented contemporary populations should have been capable of producing. He also noticed something about the walls. The precision of the upper shaft walls didn't appear to correspond with the tool types his survey associated with the pre-Spanish inhabitants of the region. Emery recorded the measurements. Then he continued with his assignment. Whatever questions the mines raised for him, they were outside the purpose of his commission. Almost 4 decades later, another researcher would look at the same landscape. Adolphe Bandelier arrived in New Mexico in 1880 under a commission from the Archaeological Institute of America. His work focused on the ruins and oral traditions of the Pueblo region. In the autumn of 1882, he visited the Cerrillos Hills. Bandelier measured the principal shaft opening at approximately 40 feet across. Its walls were described as vertical, with white feldspar and quartz visible on 3 sides. But the shaft did not simply descend into one uninterrupted space. Below the first descent, the workings branched. Much of the lower area was difficult to enter because decades of accumulated debris had made the passages dangerous without proper equipment. Bandelier recorded what he could reach. Then he made a separate observation in his private journal. Near the middle of the primary shaft, he found a section that had been deliberately blocked. It wasn't a natural collapse. It wasn't loose debris. It was a wall. The stones had been fitted together in a deliberate course, and Bandelier noted that the material used to construct the barrier did not match the surrounding geological formation. The stones had apparently been brought there. Yet this observation never appeared in the report he submitted to the Archaeological Institute. It remained in his private journal. And that distinction would become important, because in that same year, another researcher was hearing a very different description of what lay beneath the mines. Frank Hamilton Cushing was only 25 years old when he began recording the accounts. He had arrived at Zuni 3 years earlier as a staff ethnologist for the Smithsonian Institution's Bureau of American Ethnology. The expedition was led by James Stevenson. But when the expedition departed, Cushing stayed. He argued that living among the Zuni would allow him to understand things that could never be learned during a short visit. By 1882, Cushing had become deeply familiar with Zuni language and ceremonial life. He could follow ceremonial speech, had been inducted into a warrior society, and wore Zuni clothing as part of everyday life. Most importantly, he had access to conversations that earlier outsiders had not been allowed to hear. During several sessions that summer, a Zuni Rain Priest described the mines southwest of the Pueblo. Cushing's notes did not portray the underground spaces as ordinary mining tunnels. The priest described rooms, spaces that had been sealed. And the distinction mattered. They weren't simply shafts that had collapsed. They were spaces that had been intentionally closed. The account became even more specific. The chambers were said to extend eastward rather than following the direction of the ore body. That direction led toward a reliable source of water. The walls were described as deliberately smoothed, producing a uniform surface rather than the irregular texture of a naturally formed cave. And there was supposedly a final chamber. Inside it were objects that had been deliberately placed. The distinction was important in the way the Zuni account was expressed. These weren't things abandoned without purpose. They were things left in a particular place with intention. Another Zuni elder, identified in Cushing's notes by the title Kiapqui, offered a similar description. His account agreed with the Rain Priest on many physical details. But he added something different. According to Kiapqui, the chambers had been closed from the inside. Cushing treated that statement as a construction detail rather than simply a story about the distant past. The elder placed the construction in a period associated in Zuni oral categories with people who existed before the ancestral Pueblo builders. In other words, the account placed the chambers beyond the oldest named period of Zuni remembered history, and Cushing marked the statement in his notes. But oral testimony was only one side of the story. The next researcher would actually descend into the mine. In 1889, the American School of Classical Studies, operating from a research station in Santa Fe, sent a small survey team to the area. The recommendation had come from Washington Matthews of the Bureau of American Ethnology, who had reviewed Cushing's earlier notes and considered them important enough to deserve physical investigation. The expedition was led by George Dorsey. Dorsey was just 23 years old. He had not yet completed his doctoral degree. He would later spend nearly 3 decades as curator of anthropology at Chicago's Field Museum. In October 1889, Dorsey arrived with a glass plate camera, measuring equipment, and 2 Pueblo guides familiar with the surrounding region. For the first week, his documentation was thorough. He photographed and measured the upper workings. The principal pit was approximately 42 feet across, remarkably close to Bandelier's earlier measurement. Dorsey estimated the accessible shaft at around 60 feet deep. He also photographed the wall Bandelier had previously described in his private journal. The photographs showed a constructed stone face made from rectangular blocks that weren't native to the surrounding formation. The blocks had been arranged in a dry-laid course, with joints that Dorsey described as dressed, cut or prepared to fit together with considerable precision. His field notes from the first 7 days were orderly. Dates, measurements, observations, cross-checks in the margins. Everything looked like the documentation of a conventional archaeological survey. Then came the 8th day. Dorsey descended into the lower section. He went with both guides and a rope. He spent 3 days down there, and something changed in the record. Dorsey's formal report was submitted in February 1890. It was 41 pages long. The report described the upper workings and recommended further excavation. It called the site some of the most significant evidence of prehistoric extraction on the continent. But there was a conspicuous omission. The lower section was not described. The notebook that supposedly covered Dorsey's 3 days underground has never been located in the archives associated with the American School, the Field Museum, or the institutions that later received his professional papers. That absence is particularly notable because Dorsey's other Southwestern Survey records from the 1880s and 1890s are catalogued and substantially complete. The missing notebook represents the gap. But there is another document. In November 1889, between his return from the mine and the submission of his official report, Dorsey wrote to Frederick Ward Putnam, curator of Harvard's Peabody Museum. Putnam was one of the most influential American archaeologists of the period. Dorsey's letter survives in Putnam's professional papers. It confirms that Dorsey spent 3 days in the lower section. But rather than explaining exactly what he had seen, Dorsey wrote about his uncertainty over how the experience should be presented in his formal report. Putnam's response has not survived, and Dorsey never returned to the Cerrillos Hills. Over the following decade, he produced important work on subjects including the Hopi and Arapaho. He conducted other Southwestern surveys. He built a professional reputation around ceremony, material culture, and anthropology. But the Cerrillos mine disappeared from his published work. There was no further discussion of the sealed lower passage. No explanation of what might have been beyond the wall. No published account of those 3 days underground. The archaeological record wasn't the only source describing restricted underground places. Matilda Cox Stevenson, who worked with the Zuni during the same general period as Cushing, recorded a ceremonial category that she translated into English as the keepers of the lower places. According to her notes, this was a hereditary responsibility maintained by particular Zuni families. These families preserved knowledge concerning physical locations that were not supposed to be entered casually. Some required ceremonies before entry, and some contained information that outsiders were not permitted to record. The Cerrillos turquoise mines were among the locations associated with this tradition. Stevenson did not record what the keepers believed was inside those places. She recorded that she was not permitted to document it. That distinction matters. The source doesn't provide a hidden inventory of objects. It provides something more limited and in some ways more intriguing. It records that knowledge about particular physical locations was being deliberately preserved and restricted. The Cerrillos Hills weren't the only place where 19th-century researchers encountered sealed underground spaces. In 1878, Victor Mineleft surveyed Pueblo Bonito in Chaco Canyon as part of the Bureau of American Ethnology's early systematic work there. His notes described sealed lower chambers beneath the main structure. When those rooms were examined, they reportedly lacked the ordinary debris expected in abandoned spaces. The floors were clean. The walls remained intact. Mineleft distinguished between a place that had simply been abandoned and one that appeared to have been deliberately closed. His observation entered the survey record. But the formal Chaco report did not return to the issue in detail. Then, in 1881, James Stevenson conducted work at Canyon de Chelly in Arizona. His survey described sealed rooms at the base of the White House ruin. Their orientation did not correspond to the primary axis of the structure above. Stevenson measured the deviation. He recorded the anomaly. The rooms were eventually opened and found empty. But the report did not establish exactly what empty meant. Had the rooms always been empty? Had their contents been removed? Had they been intentionally cleared? The record doesn't answer that question. What it does show is that similar observations were being made at different ancient sites by different researchers during the same era. And that brings the story back to Cerrillos. The most unusual part of the Zuni account isn't necessarily that underground chambers existed. People built underground spaces. Mines branch. Rooms can be constructed. Passages can be blocked. None of those things alone proves anything extraordinary. The strange detail is the claimed manner of closure. If a passage is sealed from the outside, the explanation is straightforward. Someone enters. Someone leaves. Then the opening is blocked. But a closure made from inside raises another problem. How does the person responsible for sealing it leave? The Rain Priest and Kiapqui reportedly treated the closure as intentional. The room was not merely forgotten. It was part of a deliberate act. The same account also described objects being placed inside rather than abandoned. And this is where the archaeological record and the oral record appear to overlap. Bandelier documented a constructed wall. Dorsey photographed it. Cushing recorded descriptions of sealed rooms. Stevenson recorded the existence of hereditary knowledge concerning restricted lower places. And Dorsey, after spending 3 days underground, left behind a letter describing uncertainty about what belonged in his formal report. But none of this tells us what was actually inside the chamber. That is the critical limit of the evidence. There is no documented excavation revealing a mysterious collection of objects. There is no surviving report explaining what Dorsey saw. There is no verified archaeological discovery that settles the story. There is instead a collection of observations, separated across decades and preserved in different kinds of records. The Cerrillos Hills are now within a New Mexico state park. The principal shaft has been fenced, and portions of the upper workings have been filled for visitor safety. The surface remains accessible. The lower depths do not. The wall described by Bandelier and photographed by Dorsey has not been formally examined in the record presented here since that period. And the lower section where Dorsey spent those 3 days has not produced a published archaeological account explaining what he encountered. Meanwhile, the Zuni tradition described by Stevenson concerned specific places and the preservation of knowledge about them. Whether that knowledge still exists today in the same form is not established by the historical record presented here. What is established is that 19th-century researchers encountered a combination of physical features and oral accounts that they could not fully reconcile. William Emery measured the mines in 1846. Bandelier documented the shaft and privately recorded a constructed barrier in 1882. Cushing spent years learning the language and recorded Zuni accounts describing sealed chambers and deliberately placed objects. Dorsey arrived in 1889, photographed the wall, descended into the lower workings and spent 3 days there. Then his notebook disappeared from the archival record. His letter remained. His uncertainty remained. And the lower passage remained unexplained. Perhaps the missing notebook is nothing more than an archival accident. Perhaps the sealed chambers contained nothing unusual. Perhaps the oral traditions were describing a sacred place whose significance had little to do with physical objects at all. The surviving evidence does not allow us to choose confidently between those possibilities. But one thing makes the story difficult to dismiss completely. The mystery doesn't depend on a single dramatic claim. It comes from several independent records pointing toward the same physical landscape. A military survey, an archaeologist's private journal, a field ethnologist's notes, photographs and measurements, a missing notebook, a surviving letter, and Zuni accounts describing underground spaces that were not simply abandoned, but deliberately kept closed. More than a century has passed since Dorsey entered the lower workings. The hills remain. The mine remains. The wall remains part of the historical record. But the explanation for what was behind it does not. And perhaps that is the most fascinating part of the Cerrillos story. The unanswered question isn't simply, what was hidden beneath the mine? It's why so many separate records stop at almost exactly the same point. A surveyor measured the entrance. An archaeologist recorded the barrier. An ethnologist documented what local knowledge said was beyond it. And another archaeologist went down himself, only to leave behind an incomplete paper trail. The final chamber, if it exists as described, remains beyond the documented reach of modern investigation presented in these records. And the word Cushing carefully marked in his notebook still carries the central idea. Not simply an empty room, a space that was being held. A place whose meaning depended on what had been put there, why it had been closed, and who was permitted to know about it. The Cerrillos Hills have been studied for generations. Yet the deepest part of the story remains underground. And until that record is expanded, or the lower passage is examined in a way that can be independently documented, the mystery remains exactly where Dorsey left it, beneath the surface, behind a wall, and inside a gap in the historical record.